Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Foreman, the Associate Director of Education here at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. I want to welcome you to our webinar. So today we are talking about contributions of African American soldiers during World War I and the consequences of the Red Summer that happened in the summer of 1919 as Black soldiers are returning home to the United States. So the first thing we're going to look at is kind of the history of African Americans in the military. And you have to understand that African Americans were a part of the US military in every major conflict since the American Revolution. And about 186,000 Black soldiers volunteered for the Union Army during the American Civil War. After the Civil War, the United States Army raised 6 regiments, later known as Buffalo Soldiers. They were an all African American unit, and they were largely placed in service in the West. So they act as frontiersmen, they acted as frontier police, they acted as border patrol, they skirmished quite a bit with Indian and Native American tribes. And in the 30 years that they were in the West, there were over 200 engagements with various skirmishes and moments where Buffalo soldiers fought in the American West. They were also the primary builders and protectors of the very early National Park Service and the parks out west. So Yosemite is, of course, the large one out there. Over 380,000 African Americans served in the US military during World War I. The type of service that they were experiencing was very different from the service that white soldiers would have been asked to do. So first of all, the discrimination in the military was just as severe as discrimination in daily civil life. So many military bases were located in southern states, like in South Carolina and Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And in those states, Jim Crow laws segregated society completely. And those military bases also recognized Jim Crow laws within their borders or within their posts. So because a lot of these Black units in preparing for World War I went down to these southern states for training, southern cities witnessed a huge influx of Black soldiers. And on August 23rd, 1917, there were racial clashes between Black soldiers and white civilians in Houston, Texas. They claimed 20 lives in that riot, and it led to the court-martial of 110 Black service members. 63 of them received life sentences and 13 were executed without any trial. So white soldiers in the military, they largely refused to serve with Black soldiers. So Black soldiers were often given supply assignments and construction details and very manual labor type of positions in the military. Several Black units from the 93rd Division were placed under French command, and we'll talk about 3 of them in just a second. So in response to African Americans being placed under French command in France during World War I, the US Army sent a memo entitled "Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops." Its aim was to discourage Frenchmen from treating African American troops with respect and equality. It even asked the French military to replicate Jim Crow segregation by creating racial boundaries and imposing very strict curfews. It also recommended that Black troops were best suited for very long stays on the front lines. Now, this was to try to keep Black Americans from associating with French civilians and French society while they were under French command. The unit that's most associated with French service during World War I was the 369th Harlem Hellfighters. They arrived in France on December 27th, 1917, and they were immediately put to work in engineering and supply and construction and heavy labor projects hundreds of miles from the front. After a few months of that, the unit successfully appealed to Allied commanders to be stationed at the front. However, because white units refused to fight next to African Americans, the 369th, along with some other Black units, were placed under French command. This 369th were stationed on the front lines on the edge of the Argonne Forest, and they served 191 days on the front lines. That's more than any other American unit that served in World War I. During their time on the front, they were engaged in two major battles. The Second Battle of the Marne, the unit repelled multiple German advances, and it was actually a German officer that named them the Harlem Hellfighters for their relentless defense of their section of the front line. For their service, the entire unit received France's highest honor for bravery, the Croix de Guerre, and an additional 170 medals were awarded to members of that unit. One of the most well-known members of the 369th was James Reese Europe. He was a musician who was born in Alabama, but he was raised in Washington, D.C. And by the time the United States entered World War I, James was already considered a huge talent in early jazz. He was one of the first Black musicians to ever record music in the United States. And when his unit arrived in Spartanburg, South Carolina for their training in 1917, a member of the regiment was assaulted by some Spartanburg citizens. And several other Black units in the region responded to help out. And James Reese Europe stood between all of the fighting, and he de-escalated it and potentially averted a really severe racial riot like we had seen in Houston several months before. When he arrived in Europe, he created a military band and performed concerts when he wasn't on the front. In fact, he made headlines in the United States when his band performed for a crowd of 30,000 people in Paris. He was actually murdered by one of his band members on May 10th, 1919. He had just returned to the States and he was on a nationwide tour with his band. And he was only 38 years old whenever he died. Like the 369th, the 370th was given their nickname, the Black Devils, by Germans who faced them on the battlefield. The unit was assigned to French command, and during the Battle of Voisin, the 370th broke through the German lines and began pursuing the retreating Germans until they were halted by the news of the armistice and the agreement that was being signed. This unit received 68 Croix de Guerres and 21 Distinguished Service Crosses. They also received 1 Distinguished Service Medal. Lieutenant Colonel Duncan joined the 8th Infantry Regiment in 1902. He was promoted to a major in 1904. And during the Springfield race riots in 1908, a mob targeted Duncan's home, searching for him. And white rioters smashed through the windows. They fired gunshots into the home. They broke down the door, forced their way into the home. They destroyed all of his furniture. They looted all of his valuables. They even stole his uniform and his officer's saber. And all this while all of the other blocks on the house remained undisturbed. So Lieutenant Colonel Duncan was a target during that particular riot. He arrived in France with his unit in May of 1918. He was assigned to the front under French command again, and he was one of 60 officers in the 370th that was awarded the Croix de Guerre. And after the war, he was promoted to colonel and tasked with reorganizing the 8th Illinois Infantry of the Illinois National Guard. So his unit, the 370th, is the only unit that had all Black officers. So even the other segregated Black units during World War I, they all had white officers. The 370th was the only one that had all Black officers. The next unit that we're going to talk about is the 371st. This was an infantry regiment, and surprisingly, it didn't receive a nickname from the Germans. This unit was organized in 1917 in South Carolina, and it arrived in France in April of 1918. Again, same story. It was placed under French command. It was put on the front, and the 371st was the center of the assault during the September offensive, and the regiment actually overran German positions. It captured 47 machine guns, it captured artillery, field artillery, it captured a munitions depot, it captured a supply depot, and it even shot down 3 German airplanes during that battle. During the first 3 days of the September offensive, the regiment lost 1,065 men out of the initial 2,384 that arrived in France. One of those lost was Freddy Stower. He was a corporal in the 371st, and his company was ordered to assault Hill 188 during the September offensive. And his platoon was pinned down by German machine guns. Stower was wounded in the initial attack of the hill, but he regrouped his men and he crawled toward the British defenses. They took out the first line of machine guns, and then he ordered a charge on the second line of trenches. It was then he was hit a second time and he collapsed. He ordered his men to continue the attack, and his unit eventually took the hill. So Stowers did not survive the assault. And after his death, he was recommended for a Medal of Honor. But that recommendation was never considered. It wasn't until President George H.W. Bush in 1990 ordered the Department of the Army to conduct a review of honors awarded that would have merited the Medal of Honor if the soldier wasn't Black. It was then in 1991 that President Bush awarded Stower's surviving sisters the posthumous Medal of Honor. So his unit, not only did they receive, they all received the Croix de Guerre, they all, several Distinguished Service awards, but there was even a Medal of Honor in this unit. All of this to say that whenever they were returning home, these are just really 3 stories of Black units who served during World War I. The story goes well beyond the battlefield. The French had already fully integrated their African colonial troops into the army decades before World War I. So Black soldiers who entered France found greater acceptance by both French civilians and the French military. The way that they were treated abroad encouraged many to be more vocal about the treatment of African American communities in the United States. So Black veterans essentially enjoyed basic human decency, and they found new freedoms in France that were denied to them in the United States, despite being veterans from, as we've just seen, from very decorated units. Black units were some of the first American troops to return to the United States, and the military did that on purpose. They did not want Black troops to experience French society in a free way after the war. So they very quickly returned those troops home. And when they returned home, Black veterans were expected to adhere to the status quo of racial segregation and discrimination that had never changed in the United States. So they were treated with very little respect, and they were often attacked while wearing their uniforms. There are several accounts of Black veterans being lynched in their uniforms during the Red Summer. The post-World War I period was marked by a really significant spike in racial violence. Much of it was directed toward Black veterans returning from France. African Americans experienced a level of freedom that they had never even known to exist while they were serving in France. And that freedom was denied to them whenever they returned to the United States. So this period in the summer of 1919 is known as the Red Summer. It is intense, widespread violence shown towards African Americans from April until about December of 1919. And over the span of those 8 or 10 months, there were at least 25 racial riots that occurred in cities all across the United States, and then another 80 to 100 additional instances of racial violence in that same period of time. Now, those instances of racial violence, that could have been just, an assault and a lynching of just one or two individuals instead of a full-blown riot, or would not have been classified as a riot. So that's why I kind of broke it out there. The total number of African-American deaths are really unknown, but they can be fairly estimated to be between somewhere around 600 to 1,000 murders during that 10-month period known as the Red Summer. If you look at the slide here, I pulled headlines from really all over the country. As you see, there's an April 14th, Georgia, June 27th, Mississippi, May 15th, Vicksburg, Mississippi, May 10th, Philadelphia, August 30th is Bogalusa, Louisiana, May 29th, New London, Connecticut, July 21st, Washington, D.C. All of these headlines were pulled directly from newspapers that were reporting on all of this violence that was happening. And it was really widespread. As you can see, it covers every part of the country in just this small clippet of headlines. We're going to talk about really two major riots that occurred during the Red Summer. The bloodiest incident of the summer was in Elaine, Arkansas. Black sharecroppers, they were at a union meeting held in a church outside of Elaine. There were about 100 of the sharecroppers attending this labor union meeting, and they were ambushed by white citizens. 2 white men were killed in the initial exchange, and the white mobs, aided by the Ku Klux Klan, they were deputized by the local sheriff in order to put down what they called an uprising. A mob of 1,000 white men began to roam the county and randomly attacking and killing African Americans on a whim. The fighting lasted for 3 days before federal troops were brought in to bring it to an end. Nearly 200 African Americans were murdered in those 3 days. And their murders were not officially classified as lynchings until 2015. Following the attack, 285 African Americans were arrested, and they were held in makeshift jails. And on October 31st, 1919, 122 African Americans were charged with various crimes dealing with what they call racial disturbances. By November 5th, the first 12 men were convicted of murder, and they were sentenced to death. 65 other prisoners, hoping to avoid a death sentence, entered plea agreements, and they accepted sentences of 25 years in prison. Ultimately, the 12 men that were convicted of murder and sentenced to death, they were commuted and they were released after the Arkansas Supreme Court reviewed the cases. Historians now believe that some of the federal troops brought in to end the riot also participated in the massacre. If you look at the headline article here, it says, Negroes plan to kill all whites. So this is an regional Arkansas newspaper that was stoking fears that there was a major plot by African Americans to overthrow the white population in that particular county. And it said that slaughter was to begin with the 21 prominent men as the first victims. Those were very likely government officials, sheriffs, and judges, etc. Of course, this is completely false. The newspaper was obviously a white newspaper. It was obviously trying to cover up the violence and the murder that occurred there during this 3-day riot. The next one that we'll talk about was right here in Chicago. In July 1919, a group of African-American boys were rafting and swimming in Lake Michigan when they accidentally drifted over an invisible color line that had separated the black and the white sections of the beach. And a white beachgoer began to throw rocks at the boys, and 17-year-old Eugene Williams was struck. He slipped off of his raft and he drowned. Police who responded to the incident refused to arrest the white antagonist, and tempers rightfully flared. And a black beachgoer shot into a group of the responding police, and the violence began to spill into the streets. And it spread throughout Chicago's Black Belt on the south side of the city. And as white mobs spread across the south side of the city, black veterans armed themselves and began defending their neighborhoods. 4 days into the violence, the governor of Illinois sent the Illinois National Guard to end the riot. However, it lasted for another 3 days. So 7 days worth of violence in the south side of Chicago. 38 people were killed. There were 537 others injured. But this is the first time that we saw black veterans stand up and defend their own neighborhoods. So this is just a map of the south side of Chicago. The crosses are the incidents of mob violence. So it's where the mobs were attacking, and it's where the violence was happening. That's I guess the best way to put it here. If you notice, it's really widespread along the entirety of the south side of Chicago. The very first one, if you notice, it says 29th Street Beach. This is where, in the lower bottom corner of the map, this is where the riots actually began. And they spread quickly all the way across the south side of Chicago. I wanted to try to show you this website. It wasn't loading on my computer, so I can't show it to you, but I encourage you to look at it at home. And it's plaintalkhistory.com. And their website shows the escalation of violence. They mapped out all of the lynchings that happened from the 1830s all the way until the 1980s, I think. And it maps it out, and you're able to play the timeline. And you'll see the period that we're talking about in Red Summer, how quickly the violence spread if you take a look at this map. So I wanted to share this resource with you. I really wanted to show it to you, but it wasn't loading. So I want you to go on your computers after we talk here, and I want you to browse their website, plaintalkhistory.com, and that will show you how extensive the violence was during this period known as Red Summer. So a couple of things are happening at this very critical point in history. The first is a huge migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities. It's estimated that over 3 million African Americans migrated to the North and the Midwest between 1910 and 1940. During a second wave of migration following World War II, an additional 4 million African Americans moved from the South to other parts of the country. In this second wave, concentrations were really on the East and West coasts. But the first wave, it was to northern cities and the Midwest. So Black populations in cities like Chicago and Detroit and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and New York and DC grew very rapidly. And all of those cities had redlining laws. So it prevented African Americans from moving into neighborhoods that they weren't allowed to move into. So the south side of Chicago was the redlined district for African Americans to live. So the Black population of Chicago was around 2% before the Great Migration. By the end of World War II, it was approaching 35%. So you are talking about a lot of people in the same neighborhoods, taking up the same spaces. So living conditions declined. You had a rapid growth of Black populations in the North. And that's just one reason for the increased racial violence during the Red Summer, because 1919 is right in the middle of this Great Migration. So you had new populations competing for jobs, you had veterans returning home from the war, and of course you're going to have quite a bit of violence during this period, as we've already seen. This photograph the photograph is actually from Omaha. It's a Omaha, Nebraska train station. The headline is from Philadelphia. And the headline is, "Migration brings race problems, this woman so asserts." So the writer of the article is claiming that because all of this movement of African Americans, that there's going to bring the race problems that they were seeing in the South, they were going to bring them to the North. And she wasn't exactly wrong, as we saw in the summer of 1919. Another thing that was happening was what we call the New Negro Movement. And it is considered to be one of the earliest civil rights movements for African Americans. The New Negro Movement valued racial pride. It had organizations that were committed to uplifting the community. It focused on economic opportunities created by and for African Americans. And ideas of Black nationalism and self-determination come directly out of this very early movement. This is the movement that we saw the strengthening and growth of organizations like the NAACP, the National Urban League, Black labor unions. All of those things come out of the New Negro Movement. The Harlem Renaissance was another part of the movement. And the Harlem Renaissance is a beautiful literary and artistic movement that shaped the identity for African Americans, that very purposely broke away from white stereotypes and the racist beliefs that dominated art and society at the time. So this explosion of Black creativity created legendary musicians and authors. So jazz and blues musicians like Bunk Johnson and Bessie Smith and Duke Ellington and Ma Rainey and later on Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong all came out of this period of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes is one of the most well-known poets and novelists to come out of the Renaissance. But you also had earlier writers like James Weldon Johnson and Claude McKay, who wrote, who made really significant strides in Black literature at the time. So the Harlem Renaissance did not only happen in Harlem. It was a name given to the movement, but we saw Black artists in Chicago, in St. Louis, in New York City, even in the South, in Atlanta and New Orleans and other cities, really create some fantastic Black art and Black music during the Harlem Renaissance. Another thing that was going on during the new Negro movement, and really one of the most profound influences of the movement, was the work of key educators and intellectuals. The period before and during and after the First World War, so 1900 to 1930 really, was the rise of what we identify as the first real Black intellectuals. These are intellectual thinkers, these are writers, these are educators. W.E.B. Du Bois was a leading intellectual. Many of his writings are still studied today. I'm sure that in your history courses, you've talked about Du Bois and his writings. Marcus Garvey is a name that most of us are also familiar with. He was a very impactful intellectual. He was a Black nationalist and he was a separatist. He believed that African Americans would only be respected if they created a completely separate society and economy that wasn't reliant on white society. A. Philip Randolph was a labor organizer. He was a leader of the Pullman Porter Labor Union. He goes on to work with Martin Luther King in the modern civil rights movement. He tries to lead he successfully led the very first Washington protest for whenever Franklin Roosevelt was in office. He threatened to have a march on Washington to desegregate labor and manufacturing and military manufacturing. In order to avoid the march, Roosevelt actually did desegregate factories in order to allow for African Americans to receive higher paying jobs in them. Booker T. Washington is another name that you're going to recognize. He was a leader in Black education. He was really focused on self-help and achievement through education. So he worked at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, but he was heavily criticized for being an assimilationist. And what that means is that he was willing to accept certain degrees of Black subordination as signs of progress appeared in other areas of society. So it's okay if African Americans could only live in one part of town as long as they were able to become mechanics and become educated and become contributors to society. Mainly in things, he focused mainly on things like art and education and practical skills like mechanics and farming and those types of skills. The rise of Black intellectuals set the foundation for organizations like the NAACP and the labor unions to be able to fight later on in the 1950s and 1960s with the more modern civil rights movement that we'll talk about. Without Black veterans and without the Great Migration and the new Negro Movement, along with the Harlem Renaissance and Black intellectualism, and yes, even without the violence of Red Summer, the modern civil rights movement may have been delayed by a generation or two. Those sacrifices of those veterans and those citizens in all of these different ideas and different movements are really what laid the foundation for the new Negro movement, what changed the new Negro movement into the modern civil rights movement post World War II. Now, the fight for civil rights isn't over. In fact, it's only expanded. The fight for civil rights now includes Native American rights. It includes LGBTQ rights. It includes women's rights. And African Americans are still fighting against police brutality and racism in the legislature and in the courts, and of course, violence against their community. And today's webinar was inspired by W.E.B. Du Bois. This is an excerpt from his article, Returning Soldiers. And it says, "We return from the slavery of uniform, which the world's madness demanded us to don. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. We sing this country of ours, despite all of its better souls have done and dreamed, yet still a shameful land. We return from fighting, we return fighting." So today's webinar is inspired by this idea that the civil rights movement is not over, and Black veterans had an important role and impact on the movement as a whole. So with that, we are going to stop sharing, and I believe we have a few questions. So the tragic death of James Reese Europe can be interpreted as an example of PTSD. Yeah, Ron, you're absolutely right. This was one of his band members, one of his percussionists, that got into a quarrel with him, and he was murdered by his own band member stateside. So it happened here. It wasn't in Europe. So he survived the war just to be murdered by one of his friends. Quite a dramatic change of story there. Was the direct encouragement of Blacks to move from the South to Chicago by the Chicago Defender part of the New Negro Movement? Yes. So Leah had a great question. Yes. So Black newspapers and the Black press were an important part of the New Negro Movement. Marcus Garvey used them, W.E.B. Du Bois used them, all of the major, A. Philip Randolph used the Black press to help spread this conversation around the New Negro Movement, this idea of Black exceptionalism, this idea of Black independence. And the thing, so the press may not have been what drove people for the Great Migration. They are the ones that certainly let them know that they needed to move. So things like jobs and things like politics and the railroad, there's a reason why New Orleans, St. Louis, and Chicago are some of your biggest jazz cities in the country, and that's because the railroad goes right through them. And those jazz musicians were traveling on that circuit using those railroads. So I want to thank everyone. So give a short statement on the importance of understanding African-American involvement during World War I era. So that's a really good question, Noah. And so Noah has a question about the importance of understanding African-American involvement. And the main important thing is to realize that African Americans have been involved in every major conflict since the American Revolution. Every single one of them, they were involved in. Whether it was the Indian Wars in the West with the Buffalo Soldiers, whether it was the American Civil War with the colored volunteer units for the Union, World War I, who they served under the French, who many served under the French. Later in World War II, with the advent of still segregated units, but they were actually put into combat roles sometimes. We here at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library believe of telling a more complete story of conflict. And sure, the battles are important, the veteran stories are important, but what happens next is always the question that I'm asking. What happens after they get home? How does their experience in France change the way that they see the world around them? And as we saw with the Red Summer and then the early civil rights movement, following World War I, their service had a really significant impact on the shaping of our world today. And we try to do that all the time with no matter what content we're talking about. So we are hitting right at 40 minutes. So I want to, we have one more. Did Doris Miller have any influence on the civil rights movement? Stan, that's a great question. So Dory Miller was a World War II service member. He was in the Navy. He was at Pearl Harbor, and he became a propaganda icon, I guess you can say. While outside of what we're currently talking about with World War I, Doris Miller was in World War II, and he was in the Navy, Pearl Harbor. He was a chef or a cook's mate on a Navy ship, and he was never taught how to fire weapons or how to fire a specific anti-aircraft gun on a naval vessel. As the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he jumped in and manned an anti-aircraft gun. Nobody knows if he actually shot one down, but he jumped in and manned the gun without being trained how to fire it. And then he returned to after he saw an explosion on the, where the captain stays, where he saw an explosion, and he ran up and saved his captain, or tried to save his captain. I believe his captain ended up dying in the battle. He was awarded the Navy Cross, and then they put him on propaganda posters, and he went on a nationwide kind of propaganda campaign. And while he did not directly have influence on the civil rights movement, his valor, being untrained but still doing it, and being being a servant on a ship but still trying to protect the men he was serving with, it became a narrative about Black soldiers in World War II. So it absolutely changed the conversation about the way that African Americans were seen as fighters and as someone who can fight. So with that, thank you very much for your questions. This webinar, along with all of our webinars, are posted on, or will be posted on, a playlist on our YouTube channel. You can visit pritzkermilitary.org for our lineup of next webinars. The next one is going to be in March, and we're going to be talking about female nurses in North Africa during World War II. So we're going to welcome some folks over from the 1st Division Museum here in Chicago, and they will lead that conversation with us. So with that, have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you next time.